Hello and welcome to Nerd Punches Nerd, the only podcast where a bunch of nerds pretend to physically fight over minor pop culture minutia. I'm Jeremy, here with Benji and Sam. Say hello, Guardians.
Hello, Guardians.
Hello, Guardians.
So today we are going to be talking about this recent movie, Guardians of the Galaxy, and, you know, just some of our thoughts and feelings about said picture, or the motion picture, or lack thereof. But before we get started, in honor of this movie, we're going to have a really quick little game, and each of us is going to give 3 songs that we think should be on Awesome Mix Volume 2. Alright, so why don't we start this time with Mr. Benjomius?
Okay. This is Mr. Benjomius speaking. I think Don't Stop Believing will be on there. Or could be on there.
Alright.
I feel good. Na, 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 na.
Alright, good choice.
And then you can dance, you can dance, having the time of your life.
Pitch down, please. Alba does not sound so high pitched, but
they don't sound as good as I just sounded. Just putting it out there. I'm just putting it out there. And then a close fourth was I was thinking Stand By Me. Oh darling, darling, stand.
All right.
Stand by me. But that might be too early.
Beautiful falsetto.
And what about you, Sam Ale?
Okay, so I was looking through, because I know that we know that Awesome Mix number 2 was made around 1998. It wasn't necessarily with songs from 1998, but we know that it was made in 1998. So I was looking through songs that
1988, you mean?
Did I say 1998? Yeah, 1988.
No, there was no LaBouche on this mix.
You know, and songs that were recorded around that time, you know, going back a couple of years.
That's right.
So the first song that I saw that jumped out to me immediately was, of course, Never Gonna Give You Up by Rick Astley.
Woo!
Wait, what year was that?
Oh, you know, I just had it and then I closed the window, so now I don't know anymore.
Because I feel like, is that really the right time?
Yeah, hold on. Let me look it up. Okay. Never Gonna Give You Up is 1987.
All right, that's very close, but all right. So, wait a minute. Is that it?
No, that was just my first one. My second one was I Want to Know What Love Is by Foreigner.
I can
which
see
I think
that.
kind of fits with the theme. And then the last one is When Doves Cry by Prince.
Expensive, but I think it's pretty good. All right.
Expensive?
So I would pick
I don't quite know what that means, but okay.
the most apropos love song of all, Space Age Love Song by A Flock of Seagulls.
Okay.
Yeah, I saw your eyes. Yeah, that one. And I would also pick, since I can't pick Don't Stop Believing, I would pick another Don't Stop song, which is Don't Stop Me Now from Queen, which would be like, you know, it would be good for a bunch of situations. Right. And my final choice is also A Flock of Seagulls, which is called Iran.
Right.
Because it's actually about someone getting abducted by aliens.
It is. That's true. Ah, good point.
How does that song go?
It's like, and I ran so far away.
Exactly.
You know what song it's like.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a bunch of stuff about...
I just wanted to do the falsetto.
You just wanted to... Yeah, okay, I got you.
All right, so...
Oh, no more, get away. That song, you mean? And I ran.
Something like that, yeah.
So far away.
All right.
It was for the GTA Vice City. They did that song for that, right?
Yes, I think that's probably true.
Yeah, for that commercial, yeah.
But not that I particularly care. But anyway, so Guardians of the Galaxy is sort of an interesting thing because it first started in the 60s as sort of a group that was sort of brought out in other Marvel superhero comics. And various different people that we see were introduced at different points. The original team didn't have any of the people that are in the movie. And the most recent take on it from 2008 is the one that this is using, except there's also like one or two other characters, which I assume they're probably going to integrate later on. There's like a guy named Adam Warlock, which there is a reference to in this movie, and someone named Quasar. Mm-hmm. There was this cartoon that I've told you about, which is, the Avengers one that they had, Marvel's Greatest Superheroes one. And there was one episode where they get involved with the Guardians of the Galaxy, which includes some of the people from this team, but not all of them, including Groot and Rocket Raccoon. And of course, it's funny because I don't know if you guys remember from the Marvel vs. Capcom video game. We talked a little bit about that last time with the Deadpool stuff, but one of the characters was Rocket Raccoon. This is like a year or two ago, so maybe even longer than that. So it was before this movie had been announced. So he was more of an obscure character at that point. Mm-hmm. Right. So I think it's kind of interesting that they picked that, even though most people wouldn't have been as familiar. So, yeah, I mean, the Guardians of the Galaxy has gone through a few different iterations, a few different people in the team. Rocket Raccoon actually the name comes from the song by the Beatles, Rocky Raccoon.
Right.
Have you heard of that one?
Stepped into his room only to find Gideon's Bible. It's Rocky Raccoon stepped into his room only to find Gideon's Bible.
Oh, so he knows.
It's off the way.
Oh, yes. I do know this.
Yeah. So, and it was just one of these kind of odd things. Like, why did they pick Guardians of the Galaxy? And I'm not really sure exactly why Marvel picked this one. It's a lot of, sort of opaque stuff behind Marvel's decisions. We know I have some sort of plan, but it's hard to know what it really is. Now, you assume, of course, based off of this movie, that has something to do with all the Infinity Stones and Thanos and stuff building up. But I think this movie was also meant as sort of a gamble, because it was separate from everything else, if it had failed, they could have just kept going with all the Earth stuff.
Right.
Well, yeah, I mean, it was an opportunity for them to do something like very different from the main Marvel universe. And, they could take risks with it. This movie has a different tone than most of the other Marvel movies. It's funnier, it's sort of like less serious. Although that's not to say that it doesn't have drama, because it does. But, right. But it's, it generally, it sort of has a little bit of a different feel than a lot of the Marvel movies. Because, they have that freedom. This is in space. It's just different people. Right. It's different settings. It's, everything's different. So that certainly gave them a lot of freedom. And I think it was just the confidence that Marvel had in their brand and in, the people they were working with. I mean, James Gunn doesn't really, he's the director. He wasn't famous before he made this movie, I don't think. He's pretty much a nobody, right?
He just made some indie ones. I haven't seen Slither, and I didn't really like Super. Although a lot of people did. I mean, Joss Whedon was a fan of his.
Right.
But the point is, giving this movie to him was a lot less risky than, for example, giving Lord of the Rings to Peter Jackson, who was also kind of a small director that hadn't really done any big movies up until that point. Right. But Lord of the Rings was a huge tentpole franchise, and Guardians of the Galaxy was something where they're well, it'll probably make money. But if it doesn't, we'll be okay. And if it's a success, then great, But it's sort of they're not. I mean, they might have been financially invested in it to some degree, but they're not. It's not in the sense that if a Captain America movie bombs, or if an Iron Man movie bombs, then that could be a problem for them. When the Avengers comes out, everything's sort of tied together. And if it, this doesn't hurt Marvel's brand. If it had failed, if it had been bad, it wouldn't have hurt Marvel's brand in the same way. Right. That's really where it's a low risk. It's not a huge risk for their brand.
Okay. Yeah, I see that. It is interesting though, because they had some pretty high profile actors. They had a bunch.
Yeah, plenty.
Oh, a lot. Yeah.
Which was interesting, but it is interesting that they push this thing that most people don't even know about Guardians of the Galaxy. I didn't. Most people didn't.
No.
And it was just this thing they put in. It's kind of like they're just expanding the world, which is cool.
Well, it's also a way of doing an origin story without an origin story, because I think that's part of the gamble too, which is, at this point they've had to have origin stories to sort of introduce people to characters. But I think part of this was, well, let's see if we can manage to have an origin story that isn't even really an origin story. Like it is in terms of we see how the team gets together, but it isn't in that we don't see really that much. I mean, we see a little bit of Quill, but we don't even see that much of it. That with the time skip, we just sort of, it's basically some background for his character. We don't see how he got to where he is.
I think this movie made a specific artistic choice not to focus on, things like character introductions, in the way that like a lot of the earlier Marvel movies did. This was more focused on like, here are the characters, we're just going to jump right in and like you'll sort of figure it out as we go along.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
They were kind of fully formed as characters in a lot of ways, and it's more like if you're going to think about like a character in a movie going through a shift or a transformation, it was more the group went through transformation. I mean, each person sort of went through a transformation, but it was more the cohesive unit that went through the transformation. See what I'm saying?
Exactly. It was more about the group coming together than about like, you're going to learn who this character is and you're going to learn who that character is. It's more like they just kind of threw the characters at us, and like, because they hadn't met each other before, like we met them as the other characters were meeting them, which is kind of a cool dynamic.
Yeah.
So so there's a new rumor that's been going around, which is the new movies for Marvel are going to be in medias res, not origin stories anymore.
In medias res is a Latin term that I forget what it literally means, but it basically means like starting the story in the middle rather than in the beginning.
It means in the middle of things.
Like it's usually used when people talk about like epic poems. That's one of the characteristics of an epic poem, is that it starts the story right in the middle, and then like later it goes back and like explains what was happening beforehand.
So
but what I'm curious about, Jeremy, is like when you say that like Marvel movies are going to be like that in the future, like, I mean, they've already introduced most of the characters, so like,
well, yeah, but why is that
surprising?
Well, no, I mean that's sort of why it's interesting, and why is it surprising? So let's look at sort of what happened. I mean, the Hulk they didn't, but that's sort of unnecessary. Captain America, I feel like a lot of these characters were they sort of like, well, we need to explain the backstory. We saw how Iron Man and Captain America and Thor sort of where they came from.
Right.
And so this new movie that's going to be coming out, which is Doctor Strange, is going to not be an origin story. He's already going to be Doctor Strange when the movie starts.
Okay.
At least they're trying to move it forward.
Yeah.
It's a little bit pretentious to use the term in medias res just to refer to a movie that's like not an origin story. Like, in medias res actually means something more specific than that.
Well, I mean, like
specifically that like the movie starts in the middle of the plot.
Yes, but it could be that also. I think at least that's what a rumor is.
But the epic poem, like sort of the epic poem comparison actually kind of is apt for this, because they're doing the whole universe. I mean, it's kind of a big epic poem of the entire of the arc of the universe with whatever they're doing with the Avengers and all that shit.
Right. Well, also think about it compared to some other things. So, Man of Steel was an origin story, but it's not like we didn't already know who Superman was. So this was it was sort of their new take on an origin story.
Right.
Yeah, and
because you can't. I guess they felt like because it was a reboot, you can't do a reboot without telling the origin, because otherwise it doesn't feel like a reboot. I mean, that was their thinking. I'm not saying that's necessarily justified.
And
but I assume that's what their thinking was.
Now, Fenjo, remember when we saw The Amazing Spider-Man?
Yeah.
It was another origin story. And a lot of it was like, it just seems like it was repeating Spider-Man 1 and 2 at the same time. Plus some Spider-Man 3 thrown in there too.
Again, because it's a series reboot, And like if you do a reboot and you don't do the origin over again, then it just feels like a sequel.
Yeah, but I think if they had done that, it might have worked better.
I mean, Batman did the same thing, right? When they
That was a
Batman,
different.
they
Yeah,
did
well,
Batman Begins, which was the origin of Batman.
But
and that was actually the first movie that really got into the origin of Batman, right? The original Batman...
Exactly.
I don't remember. The original Batman, he didn't just decide to become Batman, right? He was already Batman?
That's right.
I don't remember.
Yeah,
No, you're right.
right.
So that's what I'm saying. Because Batman Begins did this, other people are copying it. But I'm saying...
It's just because Batman Begins did it. I think it's because Batman Begins started this trend of rebooting...
existing properties.
Existing properties.
Yeah.
But that's my
Jeremy was
point.
saying.
Look at the first Batman. It didn't start with an origin story.
Right, you guys are saying the same thing.
Yeah,
so I'm saying
we're agreeing.
Yeah, I'm saying
we're just like disagreeing about like a very minor technical.
All right, well, whatever.
We're basically agreeing.
So let's get into this movie. It's interesting when I sort of notice all the different people who are in it, because obviously there's some people who I know that other people aren't going to recognize. I mean, like, say, Peter Serafinovich.
Right.
Oh, wait, who was he?
You don't remember he was there?
No, I know he was. Who did he play?
He played one of the Nova guys. Don't you remember? He died.
Yeah.
He was killed.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Remember he said, for the record, I voted against you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right? And then at the end, he yells out Rocket before he dies. Which is... Why?
Why did he do that?
Because, it's sort of demonstrating that it's sort of like a very kind of... Well, I shouldn't say human, because he's not a human, but a kind of human reaction to, like, he's dying and he's sort of like, calling out to Rocket already, who...
Oh, yeah, I got it. Right. Yep.
Yeah, it was sort of sad that he's not going to be back for the sequel because he's great.
Right.
But what are you going to do?
At least Cruella de Vil will. So.
Yeah, that's right. Well, that's something else interesting. So I rewatched the trailer, and an enormous amount of the trailers, at least the official one, is not in the movie. For example, there's a line that says they call themselves the Guardians of the Galaxy, which is not in the movie.
Which is not in the movie because they don't.
Except at the very end. Very end.
No. No, not that. He calls them that. You're Guardians of the Galaxy, and that's sort of like it's.
He said like I said, yeah.
But there's no. I'm saying there was in the trailer, John C. Reilly is saying they call themselves the Guardians of the Galaxy. That.
Right. But that
okay,
obviously that's from like a different version of the script, I assume.
Well, I don't think so. I think it was intentionally. They intentionally filmed extra stuff.
Yeah.
And then
but it
put
wouldn't
that
make
into the
sense
trailer.
at that point because they hadn't even met each other yet.
Well, this is I know. So
how could they call themselves something? They aren't a team.
And then there's another thing where Glenn Close
strangers.
says, "Are you telling me that the lives of 12 billion people are in the hands of these criminals?" Again, not in the movie.
Right.
I'm just saying it's kind of interesting. I don't know if that stuff was filmed specifically for the trailer or if it was extra stuff that they, didn't include and then just use it for the trailer. By the way, it's just interesting, and I was actually glad because I don't like the trailer to spoil me on movies.
Right.
And I think in this case, it didn't really happen that much. In fact, even like if you, I guess.
So what you're saying is you prefer the trailer to lie to you and show you stuff which actually isn't in the movie.
Yeah, because I like to be surprised.
I would just prefer that it just gave sort of vague hints.
Yeah.
Of things.
And you just want the teaser trailer that doesn't show you anything.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, if I don't know anything about a movie, it might be good. I mean, it really was the original Guardians of the Galaxy trailer, originally like a year ago or whatever, that got me interested in it, which I think happened with a lot of people. But yeah.
Yeah, and that that was kind of interesting how early on.
Something that just sort of occurred to me of also maybe the point of them doing Guardians of the Galaxy was, to a certain degree, is because they're like a band of outlaws, and the other ones they're kind of a band of good guys. In one aspect or another. I mean, they have their flaws, but you know what I mean? Like, this is like a team of outlaws who are kind of still selfish in their way, but they're they're not necessarily heroic.
Right. Yeah, they're all anti-heroes.
Yeah, which is cool. Which I think is one thing people identify with. I think if you guys don't mind, I think we should talk about things we liked or didn't like about it. because I wanted to point out some things.
Okay, definitely. You want to go first?
Yeah, sure.
Right,
I guess sort of negatives and things like that. I'll just go with that first because overwhelmingly I had a positive experience with it. Negatives. First thing is the big battle. Whatever. I mean, it wasn't bad, but these big drawn out battles, like I think they're difficult to do well, and I don't know if they do it as a filler. I just think they kind of have to do it. You know, you have to do it in these movies.
Which part? You mean like the spaceship battle?
Yeah, the spaceship battle. Like there were some cool parts. Like I guess the whole net thing that was kind of cool.
Yeah, I thought the net thing was cool. It's different from like most kind of space battles that you see.
Well, yeah,
right,
it wasn't.
It was part of getting the theme of them all working together, and
also it wasn't in space. It was actually in an atmosphere.
Right. So, like, I mean, that was kind of cool, but there's just all this other stuff that I think sort of that impact was kind of lost. Like, I think, you know, to a certain degree. I don't think it was poorly done. It was just a lot of explosions and fighting, and I didn't really know what was going on for some of it. And then eventually I found what was going on. I was like, nah, you know, of course they're going to have things exploding and everything falling down, and then they're going to have a battle on the ground. You know, that stuff. So I thought that could have been done a little bit better. I also, I mean, that might have primarily been it. Like I think that was my main issue with it. There's also kind of this thing about like I didn't feel like Nova Corp like I really knew who they were, whether it was really clear like you know like why they were good or anything like that. So I don't know if they did a lot of good explanation about that, but that wasn't such a big deal. Now in terms of things that I liked, one thing in particular, like besides the fact that the ensemble was great, like you know the acting was really good. I think that goes without saying. I liked how they did Ronan. Like I think they did a legitimately good job of making him kind of a frightening villain. And it seemed like he legitimately would do all these things, even though there's like a cartoonish element to almost any sort of like super villain. I think he pulled off well. Like people were like you saw how people were genuinely afraid of him and how he was pretty ruthless. And even though Thanos sorta undermined him at times, I didn't feel like that meant that Ronan like now had his power taken away. Like it just seemed like he was this fanatical guy. So I thought that was really well done. And then I was also just really happy about Batista's performance. I thought that was great. I was so happy, and I didn't realize till later on in the movie. I was like, oh right, Batista's in this movie. I think he nailed that role like perfectly. And then Bradley Cooper, like I knew he was in it. I thought he played the raccoon. But then I was thinking about it, I was like, I really can't really hear it. I could sort of hear his voice in it, but he did a really good job with the voice acting for that. Like it didn't really sound like his voice. So anyway, those are the main things that I liked.
You know, it's interesting. I want to talk about some of that stuff. In particular, the whole dynamic between Thanos and Ronan, where you were saying like Thanos kind of undermines Ronan a little bit, but in a way that almost makes Ronan scarier because like it shows you that he's just a bully with a chip on his shoulder, which makes him dangerous. Like Thanos wasn't dangerous in this movie because he had his mind on other things. Like he wasn't concerned with this stuff, but like Ronan was trying to show you know what a big bully he was, which meant that he was going to do, you know, really like he was going to kill people. He was going to just like destroy worlds and stuff. Like he's trying to prove how badass he is, and that makes him dangerous.
Well, I think there was more to it than that. I mean, I've seen this movie twice, and to me it seems kind of clear what his motivation is, which is that
no, I mean
he's a fanatic, but that's part of it also is that he kind of gets off on fear from other people. You know, and his whole thing is, you know, he's hung up on the past, on the history, you know, which is not exactly like, I think it's actually, there's some prescience, or not even prescience, I think there's relevance in the modern world even with that for sure. You know, the idea about, we have a really complicated history, and even if things are peaceful now, it's not, some people don't want it to be peaceful. And that's sort of, you know.
What I'm saying is that, like, his interaction with Thanos didn't undermine that. If anything, it strengthened it.
Right.
Well, yeah, because
Thanos was saying stuff like I'm saying it didn't undermine him, but I'm saying like it could have, you know, when Thanos was like, "You prove yourself to just be a boy" and all that stuff. Like it could have, you know, that could have been something that would undermine him.
Yeah. I know some people didn't like Thanos, but I kind of liked that interaction.
Yeah,
I thought the particular music they used in that scene, the low bass and bassoons, like as he's turning around, like, boom. Bump, bump. I thought that was done very well.
Yeah.
And Josh Brolin is the guy who did the motion capture and voice. And he's got I like the
Josh Brolin did it?
Yeah, so
it wasn't what's his name?
Who? Well, no, it wasn't, but who are you
Wesley.
thinking of? Oh no, he did the vizier or whatever, the guy that was his assistant. The guy's like, don't talk to Thanos that way. That guy.
Right.
He sounded. I thought he sounded like the Emperor. The Star Wars Emperor.
Yeah,
I wonder if they were trying to do that.
There were clearly like some little nods to Star Wars.
Oh yeah, of course. He Ronan does a little bit of Vader-y and with Thanos.
Oh yeah, that's right. Because
even
in the beginning when he's like putting on everything. You know
yeah,
what I mean?
of course. There's a whole lot of that kind of stuff.
And like when Thanos' face appears or not Thanos, the other guy, when the Vizier's face appears on the view screen, and it's like just like the Emperor talking to Darth Vader.
Well, yeah, but there's also a little bit of like Empire Strikes Back of like the Emperor sort of showing up, being intimidating, but not doing anything.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And he's like, and it's sort of like it's in comparison. Like Vader is really powerful. Wait, this guy's even worse.
Yeah.
Of course,
anyway,
they didn't.
Yeah. So there were just a couple other things I want to say about Ben.
Yeah.
You mentioned Bradley Cooper, so it's funny because I don't know if you've seen American Hustle. But,
I haven't.
Okay, so Bradley Cooper's performance in American Hustle and his performance in Guardians of the Galaxy are not that different. I know that sounds really bizarre.
No.
But it's true.
Although his voice isn't really
plays sort of like a tightly wound, excitable character who like talks really fast, and like has like a chip on his shoulder. Like it's a similar character. So I was watching it, and to me it made sense. I was like, yeah, of course, this is Bradley Cooper. I just saw him in American Hustle.
Right.
Okay.
Now, in terms of my complaints about the movie, things I didn't like, basically any scenes where it was just like Ronan and his henchmen were like, all the momentum of the movie would just grind to a halt, and it would just be like people with hoarse voices shouting at each other for no reason. Like it was just those scenes. All those scenes were terrible. Like I didn't want to watch Thanos and his lieutenants like yelling at each other. Why is this even in the movie? There is no reason for it. Not Thanos, Ronan. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
the scenes that had Thanos I thought actually were cool, but Ronan specifically, yeah. Anyway, that was just like, it's like why is this like, this isn't funny, this isn't so that I didn't like. Other than that, I really have very few things that I can point to say like that I didn't like about the movie. Like I think you made a decent point about Nova Corps. Like we don't really know who they are or like what they stand for, or
Well,
like, is it just one planet, or is it like a whole alliance of planets, or like what's the story? Like
yes,
who are they? Who do they represent?
I think okay. So I think we can actually pick up a lot of that just by inference. By looking at how things are on that planet, the Xandar, which is the capital planet of the Nova people. Just looking at how sort of like it's bright, it's cheery, it's very diverse.
Right.
People. Stan Lee is like flirting with people.
Right. Of course.
They have
the sign of a flourishing civilization. Stan Lee
hitting on chicks.
Yeah, and also in comparison, not was it the bestly done, but maybe not. But I mean, like they're talking about how Ronan has basically destroyed, other colonies, and he's killed children of Xandarian children elsewhere. He wants to destroy their culture.
Right.
And at one point, I thought actually there was one scene I kind of liked in which Nova Prime was talking to some Kree representative, like an official government guy. She's like, at least give a. He's like, can you do something? No. She's like, at least can you give a strongly like we don't agree with what he's saying? And he's like, that's your problem.
Yeah.
And I was like,
right.
And it was actually, I felt like it was, it was pretty good because I feel like there's a little bit of, it is a peace treaty, but they don't really like each other. It seems like the peace treaty is a relatively recent thing, and this guy's like, I don't have to, and maybe he's one of these like, I kind of agree with what Ronan's doing, but I can't officially agree.
Right.
I guess one other complaint that I do have is I thought that like Gamora's character, she didn't quite have as much development as the other characters.
I agree.
Yes,
And,
that I agree with.
It was like a little too easy. Like, Quill is like seducing her, and she's like, "No, I don't want your
pelvic sorcery."
Pelvic sorcery
Pelvic
or whatever,
sorcery.
right? Which was funny, but it was also like, come on, she like clearly like wanted to be seduced a little bit. Like, I don't know, it seemed like a little out of character for her.
Why?
And just like, I mean, I guess if they had developed her more, they could have sort of explored the idea of like she was just raised as this like emotionless assassin,
okay,
and
so
like now she's like trying to learn how to like be a human being.
I think that's
so they were like hinting at that, but
it,
they didn't really give it to us in a way that I thought was satisfying.
Right. Well, I think that
also
that's part of it.
The
also.
other her sister, whose name I can't remember, what,
Nebula,
maybe Nebula. So Nebula, like, I thought was barely in it, and could have been a very interesting character, and we could have had like more from her as well. So that was a little disappointing. And maybe she'll be in the sequel. I don't know.
Well, on rewatching it, there was a few things that sort of stood out to me that didn't work as well. And one of them was when Gamora just basically says, I was there to betray Ronan. And I felt like it was like, oh, okay. But I wanted to hear a little bit more about that, because part of it is that we didn't really get a good enough backstory with her.
Right, we barely knew who she was, and she was already telling us that she wasn't that person.
I'm saying, it just wasn't like there were things that could have been interesting. Like it's like, what was she? Was she a warrior woman? Like, was she? They didn't really show her kicking that much ass. I mean,
that was another problem. There wasn't enough of that. Another thing that
I thought she pretty clearly kicked ass. Like,
but I'm saying even her faults or whatever. Like, it wasn't really clear what her faults were. And I mean, this is nitpicky. Like, I think it was still fine. Like, it still worked out. It's just that was just one thing in particular.
Well, another thing is that, like, with a later point, at the end of the movie when they said, "Oh, well, it turns out you're like half alien." It's like, well, okay, you just sort of said that when they said, it's a good thing we didn't deliver him to his dad. Yeah, that guy's a dick. I was like, okay, that's funny. Right. But I feel like the implication is already kind of obvious. Maybe my guess is that there was a little bit of studio interference in a few places.
The line about "it's a good thing we didn't deliver him to his dad," didn't that come at the end after they had said that he wasn't totally human?
No, it was right before that.
Well, okay. I mean, you saw it twice, so you would probably remember better.
Yeah,
but I thought that line actually came afterwards.
No, what happened was he gives the stone to Yondu.
Right.
They leave, and he's like, you know what? I guess it's all right that we didn't deliver Quill to his father like we were hired to, 22 years ago. Said, that guy's a real prick anyway.
Right.
And then they go into to talk to give the stone to the Nova people, and she says something like, there's something weird, something ancient that you're like unknown to us. Maybe that's why you were able to hold on.
Throw in. I felt like that was just kind of thrown in.
Well, that's what I'm saying.
It can't work. It was
I think it was like, I feel it's like the kind of thing like a studio person didn't understand the story.
Yeah.
Like, can we make it a little bit more clear that his dad was like this? And it's like, all right, fine. It was definitely like, it seemed like an after the fact type of thing. Like, let's put this in there to make it a little bit...
That seems like a pretty minor complaint, though.
Yeah,
right, well, I agree with that. But part of it, I didn't really... I actually thought that Nebula had a pretty good appearance just because she had, like, a cool presence. So I did like kind of how that was working out. At least from the perspective of a character. Even if we don't really know anything about her. But on the other hand, she's alive, so... Right. That leaves plenty of fighting for the next one.
Oh, sorry to interrupt. This is kind of off at Rave. I also just realized I didn't mention how I liked how Merle Dixon was in it. It was pretty cool.
You mean
he pretty much played Merle Dixon, but he did a good job with it.
Well, I haven't seen Walking Dead, but I knew who Michael Rooker was already. Yeah, I loved how he did the same thing. All these boys never ate a Terran before. And I loved how as he was repeating that, he's like, all right, you've been saying the same threat for 20 years.
Normal people don't eat each other.
Also, they did a good job with his what's it called, with his weapon, because what was cool about it is that how they did the music every time with it is that like there was this real fear over his weapon, even though there were all these big gigantic weapons going on, people with gigantic powers through the whole thing. Like they still managed to like show like some fear about the whole about his particular weapon, and it actually paid off well. Like you're like, okay, that is actually a pretty serious weapon, and you could see how he actually is probably an effective outlaw. So I thought that was cool. A Ravager.
Yeah, so that was kind of
Ravager
cool.
is the politically correct term.
Right. Exactly. Yep. Oh, it's on a Merle Dixon.
Yeah, so I mean, I thought that was kind of a cool thing, but I also wanted to talk about Benicio del Toro.
Yeah.
He had like a short thing, but I like what he was doing. He had this great little moment where when they open up the stone for the first time, he says like beautiful. He just like he does a great like weird thing with his arms. And then when I rewatched it, I noticed that after he gave like his whole little spiel about like the ancients and everyone who tries to use it was destroyed, and then Rocket says like, well, that was so fascinating, and he does the same thing with his hands.
Yeah.
But so there were a lot of like little things in the background in that scene. There was a dark elf from Thor. There was one of those aliens, Centauri, from the Avengers.
Yeah, I missed a lot of stuff. I wasn't really paying attention to that.
Obviously, and then well, Howard the Duck was there too, plus the dog.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't see Howard the Duck until the end, and the final after the credits scene.
Yeah, well, that was kind of. I was sort of taken aback by that kind of thing. I thought that was pretty funny. Oh,
I was actually a little disappointed. I mean, I guess it was like cool if you know who Howard the Duck is, and I vaguely know who Howard the Duck is, but it just wasn't like it wasn't as amusing as like a lot of the end credit scenes often are.
Well, I don't know about that. I mean, what other end credit scene can you think of?
The Avengers.
That
was
the one in
great.
the Avengers
That
is
was
really
the
the
best one.
pinnacle.
But that's the only other one that I think was amusing and didn't set up something. All the other ones have been like doing like, oh, here's something for the next thing.
Right, but that's cool.
Well, yeah, I guess. But this one, it was just by itself, just like a joke. So Rob Zombie actually played the voice of the Ravager computer, I should say.
Really?
And when I watched it again, it was a little obvious. So I was like, oh yeah, that's definitely his voice. Do you remember the dog?
Which dog?
The dog. Remember, there's a dog that in the Collectors that escaped.
Oh,
and
the
then
one with the like space helmet.
Yeah. So apparently that's like a real Marvel character, Cosmo the space dog.
Of course it is.
He was a Russian dog that gains telepathy and mentally speaks with a Russian accent.
And hates the capitalist pigs.
I would hope so. It's just it's kind of funny, but so it's interesting for me to think about like how music was used in this movie. So apparently, the way James Gunn added it in was he sort of put in the music into the scenes in advance before anything was cleared. So it wasn't like put in after the fact as part of a score. It was sort of he wanted it to be there for thematic reasons. How do you think?
You're talking about like not the score, but the songs,
right? Because he wanted it to be a sort of a specific.
He already knew what songs he wanted to use.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
What do you guys think about that?
What do you mean? Just opinion of doing that? Like,
yeah, how do you think it worked out in terms of how he used the music?
Oh no, great. I mean, I think it was
one of the really that's what everyone says also too. But it's one of the strong points of the movie. One of the best things.
For sure.
It's good. I mean, like the beginning was great. How like he was on this crazy planet and all that stuff, and then he puts on that song. Like I don't know, it all worked.
Yeah, that was a great opening sequence. Because it has the like the creepy score, doom 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 doom, and then it's just like, come and get your
Yeah.
I also
yeah.
thought it was interesting how like there's like this little like rat creature that runs at him and he kicks it.
That was great.
That was interesting to me specifically because there is this trope which is often used. Excuse me.
Yeah.
There's this trope which is often used in movies to establish who like the good guys are and the bad guys are, and it's like pet the dog or kick the dog, right?
Yeah.
Because in a lot of movies nowadays you have all these anti-heroes, and and like sometimes it's hard to tell who's the good guy and who's the bad guy because they both kind of do exactly the same thing. So the difference is the good guy is the one that like is nice to animals, and the bad guy is the one that's mean to animals. Now this is totally different from like Bond villains and having cats and petting the cats. That's like that's an entirely different thing.
Right.
But usually if you saw a character assault an animal like that for no reason, that would be a sign that he's the bad guy. Especially when he's like already kind of a morally gray anti-hero character like Quill. So I thought it was an interesting artistic choice that like one of the first things we see him doing is kicking an animal. Granted, it's like kind of like a ratty, ugly-looking creature. It's not like a cute creature, but
True.
even so, they're basically saying like, look, he's the bad guy because he kicked this animal, sort of.
But it also attacks him. That's what I got from it.
I think they're like playing. I think that was like a deliberate attempt to sort of like it's like a nod to the whole trope.
Yeah. I see that. That's
the
fair.
whole concept of it.
That's fair. Yeah.
So that was interesting to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty funny from that perspective. Now,
Yeah.
It's just interesting how a lot of this stuff is set up because they all sort of have different roles, but it's not like the typical archetype. Because basically, they all represent different kinds of comedic characters. Whereas like Gamora is more like the straight person, but she's more like the only straight person.
Right.
Maybe that's why she didn't seem as interesting.
Well, yeah, but you also need someone to be a straight person. Otherwise, it's not going to work as well. And also,
you need
sometimes it worked.
Or,
like
straight woman in her case.
Yeah, but especially let me give you
because the straight man, like all the wacky characters get to like play off the straight man, and that's like a dynamic in comedy where if everyone's wacky, then like it's you don't get any of those like humorous like sort of dry moments.
So there's a few places I thought like it really worked with her. For example, there was this nice touch when he like puts the headphones on her and she sort of yells. It's like it's fairly pleasant.
Yes, and she says it like really loudly. Yeah, that was hilarious.
Yeah, or when at the end where he's like their hero is like just like Kevin Bacon. So that's the kind of thing that worked very well. And if she wasn't like sort of that kind of straight-laced person, that would
or like
be
that line when they're all like trying to escape from the prison, and and Drax is like taking everything literally, and they're like rolling their eyes, and she has that line. She's like, "I'm gonna die here, surrounded by idiots."
So she said,
right?
the biggest idiots in the galaxy.
By the biggest idiots in the galaxy. That's right. And that's like you need like this straight person to like deliver like that kind of like dry, understated line. That was like one of the funniest lines in the movie.
Yeah. So I mean, this whole Star-Lord thing is one of the things I thought was really great is the reveal of his name.
Yeah, that was good.
And I was like, wow, that's really great. And also because then when you have the great payoff when Jimon Hunsu's character, the Ronin guy, comes in and he's like, Star-Lord. Finally!
Yes.
That was just such a great callback. It worked so well. And, and I also liked how he sends the question. He's like, we may be a-holes, but we're not 100% dicks. Do you believe him? Well, I don't think anyone can be 100% dick.
Yes.
And then, but also it was great because then later he says, "Oh, they got my dick message."
Yes.
Right. That was good.
So
the comedy stuff worked out well in general. Even like with like when they right before they defeat Ronan, that was good too.
The dance off.
Thing you're saying like Ronan sort of capitalizes on fear,
right?
And that's probably also what like sort of without it being too goofy, like it really worked out well. Like when he was like
What are you doing?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. The
Did we
whole.
lose Benji?
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I know like the dance off thing at the end, because I loved it. He was talking in the big and now you will pay for your crimes. And he's like, ooh, child, listen to the words, listen to the words. And he's like, dance off, you and me, bro.
Yeah, that was great. It was good. A lot of those things aren't done well. Like the whole thing where the good guy does like some sort of something goofy to distract the bad guy, because I really didn't know what was going to happen next.
Yeah,
and that
exactly.
And like even Ronan, like it didn't make Ronan look ridiculous. Like it actually sort of was consistent, because part of the thing is what jammed Ronan's radar or whatever, or his system for at least a little bit. It was just a moment. It wouldn't have lasted long. Is that normally people are just really afraid of him, so he knows how to deal with that.
Right.
Or someone's angry at him, will fight with him. But in this case, he was like, "What is going on here?"
Yeah, right. Well, like when Drax attacked him, it was like he knows how to deal with that.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah,
but this,
exactly.
like, what's going on?
Yeah, no, it did, and it's very hard for movies like this, which try to combine action and comedy to like sort of maintain that tone. Especially like a lot of movies of this style, when you get to the climax, then like the humor, the comedy is sort of forgotten, and it just becomes like action, or sometimes like they don't really know how to resolve the action, or like to keep the comedy in. And like this movie was brilliant at like, even in the final climactic moment, like having this like ridiculous moment of comedy, which worked, and like it wasn't out of place. Like it made sense, and it was funny, and like it just maintained the tone throughout.
Yeah, not
in
only
a way that is like it's just not very easy to do.
Well, not only that, but considering it leads directly into the power of friendship saving the day, which is like it's the cheesiest thing, yet it's like totally works. You're like, oh, brings like a tear to my eye a little bit here. Like, wow, that's awesome. Like, when you see like Rocket reaching up, and it's like, oh, it's it's beautiful. It works really well, and that it like calls back to this with him with his mother, and she like when she's like, take my hand, like it was just very nicely constructed. Well, right. So I mean, I haven't even gotten into the other perspectives, because obviously Drax being the sort of literal guy, were there a couple lines he said that didn't actually make sense because he shouldn't have understood them? Sure. But it doesn't, whatever.
There are a couple of things he says that are like not completely literal.
Yeah,
but
so it's like, whatever. Who cares?
Yeah.
But because he was able to do that...
Even one of his funniest lines when he's like talking about how they're all friends, and he's like, and you, Quill, you are my friend, and you, Drax, right? And he's like, and you, green-skinned whore.
Oh yeah, some people
She's like, shut up.
Yeah, some people had a problem with that line.
Really, if he was being literal, like he wouldn't have called her a whore because she's not literally selling herself for money.
Right.
But okay, it was funny.
Yeah, and so
the point is, it was funny.
Rocket obviously, was great because he was like the real, jerk. He was the real, I don't like anybody guy. And that's, like, for example, there was the great part when Drax is sort of like sad because because he failed at killing Ronan, and then Rocket says, "Oh, boo-hoo, my wife and child are dead," and then Groot has the of horror, which is, and then of course he gets into we've all lost something. So it's like there's that, which is a great like mix between the comedy thing. And there are other things like where obviously like the clip I just showed you, which is one of my favorite scenes in the movie, where they're all like trying to talk about the plan. He's like, what percentage of the plan? 12%. And he's like, oh, I am Groot. Yeah, what do you mean it's better than 11%? But then, he says, you're asking us to die, and he says yes. And then suddenly it's like, okay, it's real, and you're getting into like, serious stuff again. And she says, I have lived my life around my enemies. I would be honored to die among friends. It's like, wow, that's like a serious line. And he says, I'll be with my wife and child again. And then finally, Rocket's like, I don't have such a long lifespan anyway. You see, look, I'm standing. We're all standing in a circle. In a circle, like a bunch of idiots.
Yeah. I have an interesting question. Do you think the I am Groot jokes, that whole joke, even though it was hilarious and well done, do you think that would have been more impactful or less impactful if if there was no Hodor, at all ever. You know what I mean? If there wasn't a Game of Thrones show.
I wasn't thinking about Hodor when I was watching that.
Yeah,
Neither
also,
was I,
well, it's a different kind of thing because he does say I am Groot, but they don't mean the same thing.
Right.
Really, so there's no one who can interpret Hodor.
Right, except in a certain sense.
Well, sort of, but yeah, I mean, in this case, it was funnier, when Rocket, he knows what he's saying. Apparently, yeah.
It was pretty good.
Yeah, with Hodor.
Well, he said it in different ways.
Listening to Hodor say Hodor, it's basically like a dog barking, right?
Right.
Like a dog can bark in different ways, and it might have different emotions and trying to be communicating different things, but ultimately, it's not words, it's not language.
Right. Well.
And for Groot, the implication is that he actually is able to convey meaning through his tone, in a complex way that Hodor wouldn't really be capable of doing.
Right.
Right. Is Groot back to life? Is that?
Oh, cool. Sure. I think the idea is, since he was able to find a piece and plant it.
Yeah, although it's sort of unclear, is that going to be the same Groot, or is it a different person now? We don't know.
Well, I assume he's going to, we don't really know how it works, but I think he's going to be similar.
Yeah.
But, I think Vin Diesel also did a great job there, as the voice.
Right.
Apparently he did many, many different takes.
Yeah. I saw an interview where he was talking about it. It's weird, because one thing, he really basically didn't work with the other actors at all. The whole movie was pretty much made, and then they got him to do the voices afterwards.
Right.
But he also was talking about it. He's like, so I only say these 3 words. So I expected to walk in there and just be there for 5 minutes and say it 12 times and then leave. But it was 50 pages of script that I was recording, basically saying the same words, but with all this sort of subtle, these different. How he was supposed to say it in this way or that way, or all the things that he was supposed to be thinking when he was saying it. So they put a lot of effort into the recording sessions with him.
He's also said that he used part of him dealing with the death of Paul Walker as a way of bringing out emotion in his performance. Because obviously, those guys were very good friends.
Yeah.
And he died in, very close to when they started his recording.
That's right.
Yeah, I was very impressed. I thought it was very emotional when he sacrifices himself.
Right.
There was. That's the other thing about this movie that I think the greatest achievement of it was that it was able to balance not just action and comedy, but moments of real drama and emotion. Yeah. At several different points throughout the movie, there were points where things got really emotional, and you're I'm about to cry. This is insane, because it's the characters are so genuine and their interactions are so, so human and so meaningful. Even with the Groot, and he gets his moments and everything. That's really, I think that's what people are going to remember about this movie years from now. The fact that it has these real emotions in it, which are so they just grip you.
Mm-hmm. Even the beginning of the movie was pretty emotional. The beginning of the movie was very
so
serious.
Emotional. It was actually rewatching it was worse.
Right.
Because with the song that they play as he's listening to the headphones and everything, it was so sad. And the kid who played him was really good.
Yeah, he was.
I was and you're now you have to think wait a minute. You realize that now the grandfather, he basically he doesn't know what happened to his grandson.
Yeah.
Right.
So that's kind of pretty bad too. I wonder I really have no idea what they're going to do in the sequel, if he's going to go back to Earth, or anything.
I imagine there's going to be something with his family and his explanation of his story.
Well, I assume they're going to do something more with Nebula.
So one
his
thing
father.
that was pointed out to me by the person that I watched the movie with was that he acts like this mixtape is so precious, the one, Awesome Mix #1.
Right.
And so irreplaceable. But the fact is, he's never been back to Earth in the 20 years that he was abducted. And, he could have gone back to Earth any time.
Yeah, but his mom died.
yeah, his mom died, but like, you know, his grandfather was still there, and like, you know, even if he lost the tape, like he could go and get those songs again. Like it's not like the Earth was destroyed or whatever. Like it's
not
it's
the
a little weird how like
songs,
the Earth
Sam.
kind of like doesn't exist anymore in his mind.
The songs it's not the songs that matter. It's the tape.
No, I mean I understand that, but I'm just saying like there's this sort of this idea that like, you know, I can never, you know, this is irreplaceable and, you know, whatever. Like, but it's not like really irreplaceable. Anyway.
Well,
Right.
I mean,
well, clearly the stuff with Earth, they didn't really. It didn't ruin the movie. It was just they didn't really explore that much. You know, you didn't really have a sense of what was going on. It was really very much in the moment. It just sort of gave some backstory of him and all that. So yeah. So can we, if we're for our last part of this, can we just have like a more general discussion, as I was saying, about some of the, you could say, philosophical implications of the movie and that whole thing? Because I think it's interesting to try to analyze superhero movies sometimes in that context. Do you know what I mean?
Okay. What kind of philosophical things are you talking about?
What I was thinking of is, okay, I think often, we've talked about this before, often villains, for instance, will, if you look at it historically, you know, villains might represent what might be some sort of cultural fear at the time. So, you know, in older Dawn of the Dead movies or zombie movies, they were much slower, and, you know, there's this whole thing, and also there were a lot of like doomsday sort of you know, movies, because, you know, there's the fear of the bomb, and then the zombie thing might have been fear. Sam, I think years ago actually you said that kind of, you know, this fear of like, with the whole fear of communism and everyone being the same and all that, and being droney, like that was sort of
well, not
fear
even
at the time.
communism. It was more a fear of conformity, even in like American culture, that like everyone had to be the same, and you know.
There was that whole thing, and I was thinking like, okay, I mean, definitely like actual like action and sort of military action movies very clearly these days talk about, you know, other countries with terrorism and things like that. I mean, that's pretty that's very direct. But I was thinking about what was the thing with Ronin? What was going on there? And I actually think it was more complex in a good way than it could have been, because it could have been pretty simplified. But I was thinking like, so what's Ronin's thing? Ronin's thing is that he's a fanatic, like he's like a fundamentalist fanatic and things like that. And so, and I think there's some. Now I'm just only saying my own opinions about this. I'm not saying that this is exactly how it is. I mean, I think that in general we do have a way of just sort of demonizing the other and things like that in a lot of different conflicts around the world. And sort of we look at it like, here are these people who are just, and I'm not just talking about one thing in particular. Like we say like, you know, here are these people who are really fanatic and they're just they're hurting people for the sake of their fanaticism, whatever they think is their fundamental belief, you know, something from ancient and long ago, something like that. So I feel like that's more of what the enemy was, they were saying. So it was less of like, here's someone trying to take over the world. Here's someone who's inflicting pain basically he was committing like terrorism and genocide. That's kind of what he was. It wasn't really a power thing. So I feel like that's sort of what they were going against.
So.
I guess my other issue though is this idea of they weren't too heavy-handed with it. The idea was like, why is Nova Corps? Why would they be a good person? Why would they be good people to give, you know, the what was the name of the stone? Infinity Stone?
The Infinity Stone?
Yeah. Like, why would they be good? Now, once again, in superhero movies, they don't always do a lot of questioning of how the government works. I think Firefly did a good job of, you know, the Alliance, they weren't actually good. But the thing is, like, why is Nova Corps a good organization to give that to? Why are they, you know, not, even if they're not as bad as Ronin, why are they supposed to be good? And why would they bring things to justice? And how would you assume all those things? So I don't know. Maybe I was rambling a little bit, but these are just some of the impressions I got of like what Ronin represented and the questions I had about Nova Corps. So
I think you're saying some important things.
Yeah.
And like part of I absolutely agree. Like Ronin to me represents fanaticism combined with power. Because like fanaticism by itself, you know, isn't that scary, and power by itself isn't scary. But when you combine them, and you give fanatics who aren't reasonable, you can't like have diplomacy with them, you know, you can't like negotiate with them, and you give them the kind of power to be very destructive. That's where real fear and anxiety comes from in our culture, in our society, because of the kind of threats that we face from terrorism or from just other sorts of fanatic political movements around the world. That's what we find threatening. I think it's interesting, and I'm gonna kind of expose myself a little bit because I did not watch Man of Steel, but from what I know of Man of Steel, it seems to me that Man of Steel did not touch on that kind of real, the villain in Man of Steel wasn't threatening in a way that we relate to, in the way that the villain in Guardians of the Galaxy was threatening in a way that we relate to. Is that now, Jeremy? You have seen Man of Steel, so tell me if I'm way off base, or if this, if I'm making a valid point here.
Well, it's a different kind of thing because he's more representative of a fear of the unknown, and that our downfall comes to sort of because of something within us that we can't control.
What do you mean within us?
Because, it's the fact that Superman just sort of happens to be there. And it has nothing to do with any coincidence.
Oh, no, but I wasn't thinking it had anything to do with Superman and being there. And that probably touches on the idea of I was gonna say Julian Assange or something, people seeking asylum and things like that. But that's sort of the opposite of it, right? Because he was a fugitive from the United States and he was seeking asylum in Russia. So maybe that's how the Russians looked at it. But to me, in Superman, you have you have the threat is this powerful, something more powerful than us. It's an external government that just shows up out of nowhere. And I don't think that's something that Americans are really concerned with. We're not afraid that anyone is just going to randomly show up that's more powerful than us. We are the superpower. What we're afraid of, is I was saying, is in Guardians of the Galaxy, we're afraid of fanatics who are not rational actors. They're not governments. They make it very clear that Ronan does not represent the Kree government. He's just acting on his own. But he has he's obsessed with destroying a planet, and he has the power to do it. And nobody's willing to stand up to him and stop him. And that makes him very scary. So I think Benji, that you absolutely are hitting on a critical point there and talking about what the nature of his villainy represents. So I'm with you on that. And then you were making another point about what was your second point?
Nova Corps. It's
about
why?
Nova Corps. So I think that goes back to something that we had mentioned earlier about Nova Corps. They seem to have a free, open society, a diverse society. That's something they seem to be like us, right? So we assume they're the good guys. I can't say more about Nova Corps because the movie didn't really go
I told
into
you, that's a lot of shorthand.
Yeah, exactly.
That's how these things often are. You use shorthand because it's you don't have time to go through everything else.
Right. No, I understand that, and
you made the good point about Firefly and the Alliance and how the Alliance, that sort of turns it on its head because they they look like the good guys, but really they're not so good. But this movie is not
a corrupt government. There's at
but
least
also that's a TV show versus a movie. There's more room for nuance and complexity.
Of course. My issue, and I'm not even saying they should have done this differently because it's hard once again to put in a movie, and that's not totally what they were trying to do. But part of the thing is, and this is my personal belief, I don't think fanaticism of that type that spreads happens in a vacuum, and it's just there are some crazy people who just have a belief and do it. Usually, places where fanaticism occurs is there's something else going on. There's some issues, and and that could be related to whoever they say their enemies are, or that could be related to just where they are, in their actual proximity. So I'm saying, I think also just I have an issue with this idea of that there's just this evil that exists, and even if it's just the fanaticism, that there's just an evil that's there, and that should be dealt with, and there's no reason for them acting.
Well, no, it's
in that
clear that his
way.
motivation was revenge.
Yeah, no, revenge. Of course it was.
Yeah.
It was.
Yeah, he was not just motivated by just baseless hatred. He was motivated by revenge.
The revenge of what? What happened?
Well, I talked about this when we first started. This is it's an old war over generations between these two groups. Who knows how it started? And almost like it doesn't really even matter how it started. And these two back and forth they've been fighting for who knows how long. And he's saying, okay, my ancestors have died in these wars. And by having a peace treaty, it's like appeasement. Or even not even just that, it's a betrayal. It's a betrayal because what about all of people that I've lost and that all of my people have lost? It's disgusting that you're letting it keep going. When you see it like that, you see how...
Oh, actually, no, that does make sense. That does make sense.
Yeah, I mean, think about how people will paint negative signs. Obviously, you've seen it recently with, like, the Israel-Gaza stuff in particular, but that's just, like, how people will just automatically jump to the defense of the side they support. Mm-hmm. And I think, it's a similar kind of thing.
And it's interesting how, the Cree government, like, they just signed this peace treaty, but then they're going to turn around. They're like, well, we're not going to do anything to stop Ronan. He's your problem. Because obviously, even though they just signed this treaty, like clearly there's still like tensions, and people who don't necessarily, even if they agreed to have peace, that doesn't mean they've forgiven or that they're willing to side with the other party against one of their own. Mm-hmm. That's like a big step.
Yeah, a lot of it could be something along the lines of, well, if something were to happen, we'd be like, oh, it's a shame, but we didn't officially do anything. So you almost feel like you could put yourself in a sort of a guilt-free perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess it's like I guess that's a good point. And what's interesting about it is that like is that this was written before all the stuff that's been going on, both Israel-Gaza stuff and even like the Russia-Ukraine stuff. So
it's clearly not about those specific scenarios, but I think in a larger sense about terrorism and like like Al Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, and just the broader sense of like the threats that America sees as like these are threatening to us, groups that target us.
So I guess that's what is more impressive about it, because even when we're talking about it, like at the very in what's good about it is that it had a more complex view of it without it just being like, here are these bad guys, right here, and we're eternally good. It's more of like here are the type of people like we've been afraid of, and these sort of people exist, and then how do you deal with that? Also on like a larger scale. And I guess part of the thing too is it's like these outlaws are helping out, but they are coming together in like the defense of kind of like.
I'm hesitating about like how political we want to get here, but like
I don't know. I'm fine.
It's interesting how like in Guardians, like clearly, as you said, this movie was written before the most recent flare up of like Israeli and Gaza Palestinian conflict. Yeah. But I think that you could sort of make this analogy where Ronan is sort of like Hamas and the Cree government is like the Palestinian Authority, and they're like and people are saying like, oh, you got to get rid of Hamas to stop them, and the Palestinians are like, oh, we can't really do anything. You're on your own. You take care of it. It's sort of there are some parallels there that I see. It's interesting how topical and how relevant it is in that sense.
Well, the parallels I think have to do with like. I think the whole thing about fanaticism, I think there are the parallels there. But I mean, if you also want to get political about it too, I think you can talk about fanaticism on both sides, and those things exacerbating conflict.
Yes,
you know what I mean.
I mean, so I agree. There's fanaticism
so I'm saying is, but
NovaCorp.
But I'm saying
yes.
Yeah, but NovaCorp didn't have. What I'm saying is NovaCorp didn't have fanaticism there. That's my point. That's more the thing. So I'm saying is like.
Well, we don't know the whole history of that conflict.
Right.
We were just introduced to it at a very late stage.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah, that is true.
Yeah. Yep. So I mean, it's interesting they wrote about it, like that it's coming out now while all this stuff is going on, but like it wasn't as heated a year ago when they wrote it or whatever. So I don't know. Interesting thing to go
Yeah, I mean, so that's why it's one of those, like, well, you can't assume it's necessarily focused on a specific thing because there wasn't, necessarily anything happening. I just feel like you can draw from the same idea and just think about it. Okay, well, there's something reflective here. But I also think, there's a few little things here and there that are like, well, it's a little more sexist than it probably had to be. But on the other hand, it was a very diverse cast.
Yeah.
And yes, the main guy is a white guy named Chris, just like Thor and Captain America. Although I think that's kind of a coincidence because they're all so well cast. I can't really be mad about it. No, it's one of these things where obviously, we've talked about how with comic books, one of the reasons
it's interesting. I was thinking about this because it's a very diverse cast.
Yeah.
But most of the people of color in the cast, you don't actually see their skin, right? I mean, you have Zoe Saldana, whose skin is her skin is green, and you have like Dave Bautista, whose like skin is all like gray and red and stuff, and you have Vin Diesel, who's doing a voice of a tree, so like you don't see him, so like it's. There's diversity, but at the same time, you're like not really seeing diversity.
Michael Rooker and Karen Gillan and Lee Pace are all white, and we don't see their skin color either.
Right. Yes, that's true.
Some of the people that we do.
Also,
Sam, you have
I'm not saying that they're like deliberately hiding the people of color. I'm just saying like on the one hand it's diverse, but on the other hand, like if you had cast white people in all of those roles, like it would have made no difference in terms of how we perceive the movie.
Maybe, but I mean,
the only guy who's like a person of color that we actually like see their skin is what's the guy?
Jimon Hansu.
Yeah, Jimon Hansu.
And he's a bad guy.
The only one. He is a bad guy, but it's fine. There's nothing wrong with him being a bad guy.
I think these days you can't. I think these days it's harder to just say like they only cast black people as like bad guys or whatever. Because that's not true.
Of course.
Yeah.
Russian.
My point is just on the one hand it's a very diverse cast, but on the other hand, you can sort of like miss the diversity if you're not paying attention.
Right. No, that's true. And also Nova Corp. That's the other thing too. They're all white, pretty much.
Well, no, not just white.
But they were aliens. They were like people like with different.
They were white aliens.
Yeah.
Like
also,
red skin,
Michael. Don't forget.
Or whatever.
John C. Reilly, his wife, is a red lady.
Right.
And in fact, we see. So I noticed on rewatching it that two of the people that Rocket basically he stops from getting killed is the wife and child of John C. Reilly.
Right. Yes.
Like he explicitly saves them.
Yes. Not that he knows who they are.
No, he doesn't. But it's kind of
two people that he saves happen to be they're John C. Reilly's family.
So I don't know.
They're not human looking. I was going to say they're not human, but John C. Reilly technically isn't human either.
So there is that, but there's also this other idea about that it isn't necessarily about just one person saving the day, but it's about people being strong together and overcoming their weaknesses by finding strength, as part of the team.
But it's pretty timeless. That's the good thing about it. Like it's like a timeless theme.
Yeah, and that was one of the weaknesses of the Avengers, in that the final battle was just pew 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 pew. Like, did we really see Captain America do any Captain America stuff? Not really.
A little bit.
Yes, because we did see Captain America sort of take charge and
at
start giving orders.
Point, and we see him talk to a bunch of police officers. Yes.
Right.
We see Tony
and he's sort of directing them.
Yeah.
So that does show that he's a leader and he's operating as part of a group of people.
Right, but even let me give you an example of how they screwed up Black Widow in that movie. And I know it's 2 years later, so it's easy for me to say it, but she would have been better at sniping at people, hiding and shooting people from a distance where they couldn't see. Why is she out in the open with a little gun? That was stupid. I'm just saying.
Yes, that's true.
All right, well, listen.
I can't get too upset over it.
No, but I don't know. I just think in this case, things work together a lot better.
And they were all communicating during that battle, and sometimes they were saying like, okay, you go over here, or I'm going to handle this, or something. Like they were talking to each other while they were doing it.
It's a different also thing because it was just like a large scale battle as opposed to a specific plan. And
also like part of it was like the idea that they were kind of just like, okay, we're gonna wing it. We're just gonna like do our thing, Hulk smash, like...
Right. Well, I think I one of the things that I like about this movie is that it's sort of further making it okay to like weird or nerdy things, because this is a weird movie. I mean,
yeah. So here's the thing about that. Actually, I'm just gonna cut you off for a minute.
Okay.
We in one of our last podcasts, we were anticipating the movies of 2014 and talking about what we think will be the nerdiest movie of 2014. And Guardians of the Galaxy was brought up. I think I might have brought it up, or someone.
Right.
As a potential nerdiest movie of 2014.
Right.
And that seemed reasonable at the time. But now, if you look at how successful it is, it's almost like too successful to be nerdy. Right?
I don't think. Well,
I see what you're saying.
It's like it's got this crossover appeal where if everyone likes something, then it's not really nerdy anymore. I mean, maybe Star Wars, you could say, is still nerdy.
Yeah, I don't know about that. It's still a very obscure comic title.
I mean, the comics, yes, but I'm saying this movie, like millions of people are watching this movie.
Yeah, well, it made like 420 million worldwide right now.
Yeah.
And it's still, I mean, you still have, a guy in a floating throne, a dog in a spacesuit, a giant floating head in the middle of space that's turned into a mine.
But that's the thing, like, what Marvel is doing is Marvel is taking nerdy things and making them just mainstream. That's really... True. Really, in a broad sense, like that's what they're trying to do, and they're succeeding.
Right.
And like Guardians of the Galaxy is pretty far out there, and it's pretty impressive that they were able to do that. But it's hard to call this movie like a really nerdy movie. In a sense, it's almost like I'm just saying it's like too popular. It's
all right. So, see, now we're getting into that whole, can something be nerdy if it's popular? Right. And I think I think we've already.
I see Sam's point.
We've already said that there's a difference between popular and mainstream, because at this point maybe it will become something where the kids who watch Guardians of the Galaxy will start be thinking of like Groot or Rocket as opposed to Star Wars characters or something. But at this point, it's not really that mainstream. I feel like it's pulled into mainstream. I mean, what do you think is a nerdier movie of this year? Do you think X-Men is? No.
Maybe.
No.
No?
It's so formulaic. It's just another time travel movie. It just happens to have mutants in it.
Yeah.
Captain America 2, it wasn't even that nerdy either, because it was just a spy thriller with Captain America in it. Yes, right. This was just, a space adventure. It's just an adventure that happened to be in space. But it's just that how weird it was. It had, the ability that people had to actually watch this, I think, was impressive, because it had such a, I just think it's hard to get into this kind of thing.
Well, that's really the achievement of the filmmakers, to take something that is weird. Like, I'm with you on that, but just to take something that's weird and make it accessible. With humor, with a comedy, because it is so funny and the characters are so appealing that, like, it is accessible.
Okay, so what's nerdier? Under the Skin? I mean, The Amazing Spider-Man 2, because people didn't like it as much?
No, and I think you bring up a good point too, because it's like, is it like, what is it? Is something supposed to be bad to be? I know you're not saying that, but to be nerdy, or is it just it has to focus on other things and like maybe not have a typical formula?
This goes back to like like a couple of years ago when we first started doing these podcasts, and we were talking about like what is the definition of nerdy, and like one thing that to me, it seems to me that like in order to be nerdy, something has to have like in a sense like to some degree a limited appeal. If it appeals to everyone, then it isn't nerdy. like, and granted, I understand, like, Star Wars is like pretty, has pretty much mass appeal, but
yeah,
I think that's the exception, though. Like, there's not too much else.
I see what you're
there.
saying, Sam, but I think that's a subset of nerdiness. I remember we talked about it more as being like an obsession and getting into the world of something. Like, I don't know, but I mean, it's hard. It's whatever.
maybe so, but I mean, so Sam, can you even think of something?
Can I think of something that's nerdier that came out this year?
Yeah.
We're not having that podcast yet. That's the end of the year.
Yeah, that's
when
our
we gotta have
year
it.
in review.
I
We gotta
know,
do
but
2014 year in review.
We talked about this before, and we sort of thought that it might be The Hobbit.
That's right.
Because and it's
Yeah.
still,
But
it
it's
still
been
might be.
so disappointing in general as a series that
Well,
it's too bad to be nerdy. Maybe we'll see how the last one is.
I mean, yeah,
I really didn't like the second one.
Well, I mean, I guess you could call the video games the movie. Maybe that's the nerdiest movie of the year because it's a documentary about video games. So maybe that's the nerdiest thing.
I don't know why you're so consumed with like identifying the nerdiest movie of the year.
No, because
right
I'm
now.
saying I was talking about my whole point was that it was making more mainstream acceptance of nerdy material as a positive thing.
That far I'll agree with you. Yes, it is making things that are nerdy more mainstream and have more mainstream appeal. Yes, definitely.
Yeah, so at least that's how I feel about it. So I think that is a positive thing. Yes, it is also true that in general people will say, well, who's really attractive are attractive people. So
Right.
That's still going to be the case, even as we move on. I mean, when I saw it again, one of the people who was there was kind of like a friend of my roommates who's a little weird and a little odd, and that's never going to be the guy that's going to get all the mainstream attention. Whereas like the good-looking guy that happens to be wearing a I am Groot and Groot is my dick T-shirt. By the way, if that's not a T-shirt, it should be.
It should be.
Jeremy, copyright, trademark it before anyone gets to it.
I don't think I can copyright an existing property, but I appreciate
That's the whole thing. And then if you see someone with that shirt online, you have to try to do a strike on their YouTube account.
Yes. Either that or challenge
inside
them to a
joke
duel.
of Nerd Punch's Nerd that no one's going to get with the three of us.
Right. All right, guys, here's my next question for you. If you were to, as we sort of wrap it up, if you could rate this movie on a scale of, let's say...
before we rate it, or maybe after we rate it.
Okay.
I feel like we should try to identify, like, where does this movie rank in the, amongst other Marvel movies or other comic book movies.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, I was actually going to bring that up, but...
Okay, so let's do the rating first, then, and then we'll talk about the...
Yeah, because I was going to say, if we think about, like, all the different superhero movies and everything, there's a lot of options, obviously, but, how does it rate from a scale of... Let's say X-Men Origins Wolverine / Batman and Robin to The Dark Knight. Where does it, as 1 to 10, where do you think it falls?
Okay. So I'll say, like, I think that it's up there in the top 5, and maybe even the top 3. I think this form of superhero movies has been perfected more and more so in recent years to a certain degree. So I'd say, I don't know about number 1.
Wait, are we rating it on a scale of 1 to 10, or are we actually like ranking it against other movies?
Against other movies.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'd say, God, I don't even know what my favorite is. In some sense, it might be X2. In some sense, it might be The Dark Knight. But I'd say Guardians of the Galaxy is either 3 or 4. That's what I would say. Compared to others.
I mean, Sam, you recently did that same quiz.
Yeah.
The top superhero movies.
Yeah. I'm actually looking. I went back to remind myself what my top 5 were.
Right.
So my top 5 according to the quiz, which has like sort of it's like a tournament system, so it's it's not necessarily, you're not going to get the same results every time depending on the seeding. But my top 5 after taking that quiz were Dark Knight, Avengers, X-Men First Class, Batman Begins, and X-Men Days of Future Past.
Right. So the question is, would you put Guardians?
Where does Guardians fit? Like and that's pretty reasonable. I think that's pretty accurate in terms of like what I think the best comic book movies are. So where does Guardians fit on that list? That's tough. It's definitely no worse than 3. The top 2 are Dark Knight and Avengers. The question is whether I feel Guardians might actually have been better than Avengers.
I think it was, like, when it comes down to it.
It's tough
as a movie.
to say. It's tough to say because, like, I love Avengers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Avengers is a fantastic movie.
It
but
is.
At the same time, it has certain flaws. The plot is relatively simple. And like as Jeremy was saying, like, in the battle at the end, they're not really like working as a team, or like there's certain things you can sort of nitpick with it.
Yeah, a lot of it was more like, all right, in the final battle, everyone does something cool, but that's sort of like the extent of their arc or anything.
Yeah, it wasn't. The point is, Avengers wasn't as ambitious as, say, the Dark Knight, or even the Dark Knight Rises.
I've argued that for a long time,
which was a far inferior movie, but but
I've argued for a long time about that. That I think the Avengers is very flawed, but it was the movie that had to be as successful as it was. Right. So I don't really. I can't.
Maybe this is just like the recency effect talking, but like I right now I kind of feel like I could put Guardians number 2 behind Dark Knight, but ahead of Avengers.
And how does it compare to Days of Future Past or Captain America 2?
I put it ahead of both Days of Future Past and Captain America 2.
Right.
Captain America 2, Captain America 2 is a very solid movie, but I didn't like it as much as you did.
Okay, so for me, it's interesting to see how like things change. Because when I look back, I never saw any of the original Superman movies. Right. I did like, Batman Returns, but in retrospect, it's not as good as I thought it was. And obviously, the other Batman movies I don't really care for so much, especially Batman Forever. Batman and Robin is just sort of fun.
Batman and Robin you actually kind of like a little bit.
I do. I do kind of like it just because how stupid it is.
Yeah.
It's but it's enjoyably stupid. Yeah, but then, Spider-Man I do legitimately like. Even now, I still like it. And the X-Men movies I feel like sort of diminishing over time. Like the more other things have come out, the lesser it looks in retrospect. Yeah. And I think Spider-Man still holds up a lot better.
Yeah.
But
although that also does apply. It applies to Spider-Man also. Spider-Man is diminishing slowly over time.
Yeah.
1 and 2.
But not as much as X-Men, at least in my opinion.
Yeah. Now, the first two Spider-Man movies, we haven't really talked about it. Those were pretty good. Those were some of the best superhero movies.
I mean, when I look at I look at these like Marvel ones that have come out, and like starting from, I guess, from Iron Man, because I didn't watch The Incredible Hulk. So basically, it started at a pretty high point. It's like, wow, that's really great.
Yeah,
it's like
Iron Man kind of kicked things off,
and
because Iron Man was like a big hit.
Is it perfect? No, but it's still pretty great.
But it's a good movie.
There was the Hulk after that I didn't watch, and then after that was Iron Man 2, which was like, it's almost it was really like a studio movie. It was we're trying to make this more like. We got to set up for the Avengers and remind people, set things into place. So I think it failed more because of that. And Thor was kind of fun, but it certainly wasn't as good as Iron Man. And then Captain America I did like a lot. Again, not as good as Iron Man, but still very good. And then you had the Avengers. That was right after. Right. So at that point, it had some amazing dialogue and some really fun action pieces. A lot of it didn't really make any sense. And even, we've listened to Joss Whedon's commentary, which is awesome.
Yeah.
Amazing commentary. And he even says, I know this scene didn't make any sense, but we had to put in a scene of Thor versus Captain America's hammer, because we just had to.
Right.
So, he was really great in that commentary. It was very entertaining to watch it again just with the commentary. So,
Well, he's an interesting guy to listen to. You know, he talks about the craft of the filmmaking, but he also talks about the characters, and you know, like it's you know, like how he wanted to try to get the actors. You know, like his directing. We think of directing as just like pointing a camera at something, but like directing really means getting actors to express themselves in a certain way.
But at that point,
like, you know.
Yeah,
that's you know these little moments he talks about, you know, like characters making eye contact and things like that, you know, that are important to the movie, like little subtle things. Well, anyway, you were saying Avengers.
At that point, I was a little worried.
By far the best movie, you know, in the Marvel world that we had seen.
I was like, all right, well, obviously Avengers 2, because if Joss Whedon's doing it, well, of course it will be great. But what about all these other ones? I was a little worried about, you know, the diminishing returns. And Iron Man 3 didn't exactly assuage my guilt, my like feeling about it. It wasn't a bad movie. It was certainly better than Iron Man 2, but it didn't like have like, oh, this, you know, the same kind of this enjoyment. It had a lot of holes in it from my perspective. And although like there was a lot of really great acting, I ultimately felt kind of let down by the ending. It's like, all right, well, I guess.
Right. And there was also like Thor 2.
And Thor 2 was one of these things where it was another little bit too much of the setting of the stage thing. Like we got to set up for Avengers 2.
Was, I think, a weak movie. Like,
and
that
although
was actually an example of where Thor 2 of like it had like it tried to have like comedy in it too. It just was disjointed with the comedy and the serious parts.
And although some of it definitely worked, and like I did like actually a lot of the final battle because I thought it was done more in like with like the portals and everything going through the different worlds. That was kind of like a cool thing that we haven't really seen before. But a lot of it, I mean, the villain was kind of boring. And he didn't really... What was his motivation? I want everything to be destroyed in darkness. That's a stupid motivation. You know, I mean, okay, yes, his motivation was defined, I guess, but it was not an interesting one. And there was also a lot of, like, history there. But then...
Right. Captain America, we had, like, these X-Men movies also, I mean, coming out at the same time.
Well, actually, X-Men First Class came out before the Avengers.
First Class came out before Avengers?
Yeah, it was 2011.
Yeah, it did.
Was it?
Oh yeah, of course. I remember because that was like it was the same year as Thor and Captain America. It was like a huge, you know, comic book year. Of course, this is also.
For some reason, I thought First Class was after Avengers. I don't know. Anyway.
And, well, the point is, I was like, wow, I was really impressed by Captain America 2, and I liked the one. I was like, okay, wow, this is an improvement over the last 2 movies I've seen. It was hard for me to like say, well, it's such a different movie from the Avengers. I can't really like put it ahead of that. But it's definitely better than Thor 2 or Iron Man 3 or Iron Man 2. So from that perspective, I was like, okay, well, hey, that's pretty good. And I was, you know, thinking about Guardians of the Galaxy. It was just such a wild card. It looked great just from the trailers, like they had the right idea. And I really liked it. I mean, it's hard to say. I've been going back and forth. I really enjoyed rewatching it again. And, you know, that's often a good sign of something that's a good movie. You know, something that hits you the same way. And a lot of it totally did. Like, it hit me the same way again. You know, obviously, there is no such thing as a perfect movie. Even The Dark Knight isn't a perfect movie. You know, at the end of The Dark Knight, I was so blown away by that more than any other comic book movie I've seen.
Yeah.
But Guardians is pretty close to that.
Yeah.
So I think from that perspective, just from the... I remember I've talked about how, like, you know, I have these sort of different categories for how I quantify a movie, because you can't really... I don't like the number system, because I think it's kind of flawed. Or even grades. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
So I say, okay, what I look at acting, story, the look, the feel, and the point. And then I say, like, how does it matter? Does it matter at all? Right. Is it like pointless? Does it have something it's trying to, you know, that it's saying that's interesting about, you know, our society or whatever? And the feel is also important. Like, how do I feel after I've left this movie? And I'm like, that was fun, and then move on. Because that totally happens all the time. I see a lot of movies that are just like, well, that was all right. You know, good acting, but it's not going to stick with me. You know?
Yeah.
And that, you know, there's, I think, like the Sin City movie I just saw, you know, I liked it, but it's not going to be, like, amazing. You know, the first Sin City movie just blew me away by how different it was. But this is the same thing.
Yes, I remember when I first saw the first Sin City movie, it blew me away. I was like, wow, that's a great movie. Like, if I went back and watched it again, I would probably, you know, pick flaws at it, you know, and like find ways that it's not that great or whatever. But I remember being blown away at the time. Anyway, Jeremy, we gotta hold you to your final ranking.
And
so,
that's I'm gonna have to give it a number 2 for right now.
Okay.
In the big
so your
Surpass.
top movies are Dark Knight, Guardians, then Captain America 2.
Yes, then the Avengers,
then
and then X-Men First Class.
And then X-Men First Class.
I know that's different from you guys, but I liked it more than Days of Future Past.
Yeah, well, that's okay.
I mean, I still put that one better than any of the other X-Men movies.
I mean, it's really I would more quibble with you on how much you liked Captain America 2.
No, we could get into that another time.
X-Men movies, but that's like a whole different discussion,
right?
And we can't talk about that too much because Benji hasn't seen it yet.
Okay, well, I feel like we're all pretty positive. You know, we all sort of recognize the flaws, but we also see a lot of the gain. And I'm certainly looking forward to seeing, you know, what they do next. Because, I mean, at this point, I feel like, you know, they've earned enough goodwill over even making mistakes that I can still be like, I mean, you know, Pixar sort of done the same thing where they kind of screwed over a little bit with the Cars stuff. And if their next movie is really great, be like, all right, okay, so you've learned from what you screwed up. And whereas if they don't, I'll be like a little worried, but I guess we'll see. You know, the next one is the next movie is next year.
It's an unfair standard though that Pixar sort of created for itself.
It did, unfortunately.
Of like every single movie has to be amazing.
Well,
like,
right. So
who can do that? Nobody can do that.
Clearly, not even them.
It's unfair.
Right.
But they did it to themselves by making so many good movies.
So let's think I mean, just thinking about what comes next. Next year, we have 2 movies from Marvel. You know, there's the Avengers 2 plus Ant-Man, which, you know, just started filming, which is like, I don't know.
The real question is, like, does anyone have any... You were just saying, like, whatever, Marvel has, like, a pretty good brand, and, like, they've established that they make pretty good movies, but, like, is anyone really excited to watch Ant-Man or, like, Doctor Strange or whatever?
I'm a little interested in that. The Doctor Strange one is more interesting to me than Ant-Man. And, you know, eventually, you know, the year after that, of course, is Captain America 3, X-Men Apocalypse, Doctor Strange. Also the Sinister Six, which is a Spider-Man nonsense. And more Fantastic Four, another Spider-Man, and then you know, eventually, you know, and then you're going to have, like, around the same time, you're going to have, you know, the Superman, Batman stuff. So it's going to be quite a bunch of things coming up. The
question to me is, like, are they finally going to make a good Fantastic Four movie?
Well, you know what?
Now that like so many other good superhero movies have been made, and there's sort of like a model of like, this is how you make a good superhero movie. You know, like, what?
You know,
what
it's interesting because
actually, like,
have you guys seen Chronicle?
No.
Okay, so the director of that, and that's all he's directed, and I liked it, is also doing Fantastic Four with Kate Mara from House of Cards, Miles Teller, who I think is a pretty funny guy, Michael B. Jordan from, like, The Wire. He's also he's very good, you know, and Jamie Bell. You know, so who knows? But that's just all in the future. And for right now, I think we can just say, as we wrap it up, was this the best movie of all time? No, but maybe the 17th.
Okay, fair enough.
All right, guys. Nerd you
later.
Get
out there on IMDb.
Yeah, right. Nerd you later.
Make this movie the 17th most popular.
All right, Sam, ready? Nerd you later.
I'm ready. Are you ready?
Nerd you later, Sam.
Nerd you later. Nerd you later, Sam.
Nerd you later.